The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Once upon a time, in a community choir, or maybe even a ballet school company, a group of young performers undertook the study of Carmina Burana. Of course, their director probably had some local scholar of the Middle Ages visit them and explain the meaning of a lot of the texts, both the profound and the somewhat naughty implications. My own mother, as a schoolgirl in early 1950s Germany, had none other than Karl Orff himself come to her school. And as she described it, she and her female classmates all blushed when he shyly translated some of the incredibly romantic verses from the second half. But back with our more contemporary performers, while they more or less remembered the general idea of each song, the exact meaning of the verses soon was forgotten, and they found themselves intentionally mishearing the words, reinterpreting them into a more modern tongue with usually very silly phrases. There are so many of these mondegreens applied to the first song, O Fortuna, that there's an entire video of them, which I've linked below. The answer is that it's quite apropos in light of the elevated tongue-in-cheek setting of the poem Floret, silva, nobilis, probably the most obviously comedic moment in Orff's song cycle. An examination of the lyrics only tangentially reveals their humorous potential. A two-part poem in which the medieval Latin of the first half is nearly identically repeated in Middle High German. After briefly setting the scene of the blossoming, leafy green woods, the perfect place for a tryst, the poetess searches in vain for a lover of old. Where is he? He's ridden off. Who will love her now? It's all rather sweet and coy, which is just the springboard that Orff needs. A quick preview of the score shows a kind of operatic tone painting. With the first line sung lustily by full choir and tutti orchestra, which I'll start breaking down for you in a minute, never fear. You can see lots of repeated textual phrases and words, fitting into very dramatic, rhythmic gestures. As the second line describes the burgeoning woods as blossoming and leafy, repetition becomes even more pronounced, with the word et, and in Latin, used as an extended connecting phrase between the two adjectives, the latter of which becomes very dancey and playful. In the next section, a reduced female choir, designated as coro piccolo, searches for their lover of old in a similarly dance-like, sparsely accompanied passage. Here we see the musical phrasing reflect folk origins, even children's songs. This is all to evoke a kind of childlike innocence, and even perhaps naivety, which is rudely shattered by the revelation in reduced tenors that their love has hightailed it the hell out of there with all due speed on his horse, illustrated by savage digs on open strings, bombarding timpani, and then a gradually retreating galloping sound by both sections as he makes a clean getaway. The upper choir then wonders who will love them now, only to be answered by a soft repeat of the galloping hoofbeats getting further and further away, leaving them to simply sigh with glorious, transcendent regret. Then Orff simply repeats the whole joke, but in mostly Middle High German, as I mentioned before. Well, it's certainly not Saturday Night Live level of comedy, or Kids in the Hall for that matter, but it does demonstrate the kind of free-spirited horseplay of the Goliards who wrote the poem, or perhaps wrote it down from a woman songwriter of their acquaintance. So let's take a very close look at the score now to see just how Orff uses the orchestral palette to paint humor, not just grandeur. This huge screen here, setting the first verse, actually contains 4 discrete orchestration approaches, one for each musical phrase. So let's explore each one individually. But first, a quick look at the lineup, which, though full-sounding, is actually quite economical. A pair each of flutes and clarinets, only 1 oboe and 1 bassoon, 4 horns, scored across individual staves, tuba, timpani, tambourine, and triangle, full choir, then a string section with divisi staves for firsts, seconds, and violas. For the first phrase, the choir illustrates the core ideas, a full-throated, gloriously magnified chorale, harmonized under a very simple melody going back and forth between the 2 scale steps most familiar to children's songs, the dominant and the mediant. The male voices exactly duplicate the female voices an octave lower, alternating between root and second inversion triads. This interplay ends with a graceful descent to the tonic, in which the parts gradually telescope down to the single unison pitch of G. After a 1-bar reaction from the violins, the last 3 bars of choir, not to mention the entire orchestra, repeats itself exactly. And speaking of that orchestra, let's see how the winds double the melody. Clarinets and high first bassoon doubling the upper choir at pitch, note for note, with punchier articulation at the end for better clarity, and flutes plus first oboe in the same exact relationships an octave higher. Double reeds in octaves on the lowest pitch of each chord, under octave thirds in stacked clarinets and flutes makes for a wonderfully solid yet bright tone, adding a radiant edge to the choir. Sliding back down the screen to compare with the strings, we see that on-beat notes in the violin figuration double the winds in choir, the firsts hitting those same B-thirds and G-thirds of the flutes, and the seconds doing the same, doubling the clarinets and sopranos. These tenuto hit points alternate between little D-E-D slurs, or just single Ds. Finishing the phrases, we see an extra little curve added over the choir and wind doubling, echoing the motion of the previous figuration on the one hand, and creating a walk down in sixths on the other, which is echoed in thirds an octave lower as we saw before. Interestingly, this gesture is essentially the same idea which just ended the previous movement, the instrumental Tanz, which kicks off the Auf dem Anger section, and also ends that section in the song Wäre die Welt alle min a few songs later. You can study both numbers in the playlist linked below. Staying with the strings, you might be wondering whether they double the altos and basses as well. And the answer is that they do, after a fashion. Orff has transformed the basic curve of their part into something more energetic and beefy. Very easy accented double stops in the divisi violas on those same downbeat Gs, with vigorous little upward pushing approaches to the alternating Ds. After which, elements of the alto and bass lines are incorporated into a richly harmonized series of chords. The cello part also supports a few notes from the choir basses, while harmonizing the viola's little walk upwards, and landing heavily on downbeats and upbeats with rich, gutsy, but really easy to play, triple stops. The double basses merely underpin the entire proceedings with low Gs and Ds, keeping things simple. Though notice how in the third bar, that by tying the anticipatory chord across the bar line, starting the violin's figuration on beat 3, and so on, Orff makes the downbeat of the fourth bar sound like a syncopation, which it is in a way, as he's simply taken away a beat from a regular 3-4 rhythm a beat early, and compensated with a bar of 2-4. We see all this even more obviously thought out in the brass and percussion parts above, with fourth horn, tuba, and timpani reinforcing the double bass part with great solidity. Notice how horn and timpani go up while the tuba goes down to double the bass's lower D. But in a sense, just setting up an umpa pattern with simple G major triads on the rest of the horns, with a D octave and a fifth toward the end. Tambourine simply colors the little walk-up of the violas and cellos with some rattling fizz. But you can see how Orff's dropped a beat off the pattern in the third and seventh bars, and adjusted the rhythm in the next curtailed bars. By doing this, he keeps his listeners' expectations from settling into the familiar groove of a waltz or minuet. This feels more ancient, glorious but unpolished, even a bit uncouth. Having set a powerfully evocative scene of the burgeoning woods of springtime, Orff drops down the energy to describe its aspects. First in its flowering, floribus, which he scores onto the choir by adding yet another familiar pitch to the customary arsenal of children's melodies, the E, making this melody in the sopranos very similar to the classic schoolyard taunting song. But at least this flowing, repeated motif is gentle and sweet rather than mocking, harmonized from below in thirds by altos, and stabilized by G-fifths in the lower choir. It's all very settled, but not dull. Above, the winds hover in a soft but accented stack of G major triads, alternating to accented staccato D octaves and fifths against the G major completion of each phrase in the choir, turning that A in the winds into a bit of a cluster. Those Ds in the winds are nicely underpinned by a D octave in first and third horn, and a light tap on timpani and a ting on triangle. The mezzo forte accent of the pizzicato strings merely balances against the fuller attack and sustain of the winds, playing big strumming triple and quadruple stop D octaves in support. Not the easiest thing to do for the violins, but they have plenty of time to set their fingers. Since there's an open D in every instrument here, though, you can see the benefits of writing this song in the key of G. The woods are flowering, but now Orff needs to link forward to the description of them being leafy, and the linking word is a simple et, meaning and. This would sound a bit awkward in English, as we don't usually hang mellifluously on conjunctions, but it makes perfect sense in Latin, and as we'll see later, in German as well. The scoring here is straightforward, but nonetheless effective, even imaginative. Sopranos and altos continuing their melodic relationship harmonized in thirds, while tenors and basses sit on a D octave below. The soprano line is supported at pitch by first oboe, and the harmonization of both upper choir parts is doubled an octave higher in the flutes. This gives the female singers a warm color, but with a cooler radiance above. And similarly warm are the doublings of first bassoon and cellos with tenors, and fourth horn plus double basses with choir basses. All well and good, but the energy in this connecting passage comes from the little offbeat rhythm from clarinets, first and third horns, percussion, and pizzicato strings. Notice that it isn't all just repeated Ds, as we see in horns and timpani, and lower pitches of violin double stops. There's also a rising line in contrary motion to the upper choir, starting on C thirds at the beginning and then ascending up to an F sharp third, turning the resolution into a bit of a jazz chord, a tonic major ninth, though these last notes are barely perceptible considering the balance of elements. I love how the second phrase echoes the first down a notch dynamically. A basic dramatic tweak, but it makes the following bars return to the precedings feel more emphatic, even at mezzo piano. Wrapping up the overall passage, Orff doubles down on the song's playful, childlike character, with a skipping, almost taunting interplay between tenors and the rest of the choir, simply repeating the word foliis, meaning leafy, 3 times as before with floribus. And with this ever more frolicsome attitude, the accompaniment simplifies down to a kind of 5/4 umpa pattern, Ds resolving up to Gs again and again, in staccato tuba and tenuto staccato lower strings, a kind of intensely tiptoeing combined articulation, alternating with simple triple-stop strums in pizzicato upper strings, overlaid with staccato chords in the winds and horns. It's very cool how either section fills in some of the missing pitches of the other, making a seamless whole, and also how the timpani firms up these alternating chords, rather than just thumping the downbeat with the lower strings and tuba. Along with a little glittering touch from triangle, the energy remains light-footed and innocent, perfectly brought to a close by glowing octave flutes and oboe at the end. Before we go on to the next screen, let's listen to that whole opening passage once again with the score. Take special note of the dramatic touches, the full-bodied merriment of the first 9 bars, followed by the more childlike sense of wonder on Floribus, the more meditative transition on Et, and finally the playful finish with Foliis. Orff is not only tone-painting the woods in springtime here, he's also setting things up for the frivolity to come in the second half. After the huge lengths I just went to in analyzing that last screen, you may well be wondering whether you'll ever get to the end of this lecture, and just how long it will take for me to explain this page. And the good news for everyone out there on a tight schedule is that this screen and the next 2 are much simpler in architecture, so I'm really more than half done already. For, in fact, the basic elements of this page are comprised of only about 4 bars, repeated and interconnected in various ways. But each of those bars and the phrases they comprise are well worth digging into, starting with the reduced upper choir, marked coro piccolo, so in other words, a smaller contingent of singers for a more intimate sound. And so it should be for the setting of the idly pining lyrics, Ubi est antiquus meus amicus, where's that old lover of mine? Here we see a rare phrase mark slurring over the culando, cradling, as in a lullaby, phrase in the first 3 bars, a bite on the consonants implied by the accents, but still with a smooth as silk legato. Orff is keeping it simple melodically, alternating back and forth over a G major triad. Divisi first violins support the choir, with little tiny swells of emphasis at the start of each pitch, a bit like a pulsing heartbeat. These same pitches are doubled by the second violins, but alternating with open Ds in a gently rocking pattern. The meaning is clear. The poetess misses the emotional comfort food of her lover's indulgent affections, which to her were like being gently rocked into a blissful sleep. Below, the violas and cellos divide up into desks by 3s on each of their upper divisi staves. So the first desk of each string group will be plucking the various patterns, while the next 2 desks behind them bow gently over the same notes. This is one way of simulating the attack and sustain characteristics of piano tones, though of course it doesn't come anywhere close to evoking the same timbre. I love this one little octave harmonic, slurring down to an open D in the cellos. That is simply achieved by touching the octave note of the first note, then lifting on the second, a very gentle and subtle change of tones. Then the lower divisi staves just hold down a simple G pitch, or G fifth, doubled on the lowest cello pitch by double basses, all of which can be played on open strings. This is immediately followed by Meus amicus, my lover, literally my friend, but obviously more intimate in this context. We're back to the playful umpa beat of Foliis on the previous screen, with a skipping melody of happy anticipation from the choir, starting from a unison D slurring up to harmonized thirds as before. You can really hear once again how just putting that E into the melody connects us to more childlike sensibilities. Once again, tuba and lower strings conspire on low Ds and Gs, except with pizzicato this time from the latter, The chords are simplicity personified. Violas and first horn sharing repeated Ds, first oboe and first bassoon repeating octave Gs, then clarinets and flutes playing C thirds and B thirds an octave apart. The nifty parts definitely go to the violins. High pizzicato fingered D6s, alternating with open D4s 2 octaves lower. Adding the accents into the equation, the sum is a spiky-sounding accompaniment, especially factoring in the inherent tone clusters in every other bar. Jumping to the end of this passage, even a very simple fading octave G on the syllable ah in the choir can teach a lesson or two. Orff doesn't bother doubling the altos below, but instead creates a mixed timbre supporting the sopranos of unison second flute and first oboe. This calls back to that so-called rule of 3 one hears about from time to time. The notion that 3 balanced timbres from 3 different instruments will create a new unique sound. And there is a nicely blended sound there at the top, especially with first flute reinforcing the overtones along to a ting on glockenspiel. Now that we've broken down each individual element, let's put them all back together and listen to this whole screen with the reference audio. As before, notice Orff's dramatic contrasts, taking lessons from composers before him, starting with Haydn and Mozart, through the 19th century opera composers, to the post-Romantic period, that extreme changes of character and energy can enhance the elements of comedy and drama. The further we get into this, the simpler it becomes, because this is evolving more and more into broader comedic strokes rather than subtleties. That's plain from the very first bars here on this screen, with the whole string section playing emphatic open pitches in a mock-heroic galloping rhythm. The down bow marks simply mean that Orff wants the players to recover their bows for a fresh downstroke at the start of each pair of beats, not that every stroke should be a down bow, which would be somewhat awkward. Notice that all these same open pitches continue for the rest of the passage, in gradually diminishing pizzicato. Of course, the most memorable thing on this screen will probably be the timpani solo. Orff has worked it out so that one of the section percussionists comes over to the timpani station to assist. The first timpanist playing the solo across their kettles, starting from the piccolo kettle at the top and working their way down, then settling into repeated fifths accented every other stroke. Meanwhile, the second player lays down a softly galloping tattoo on that top kettle now that the first player is done with it. It's an effective strategy for clarity, not to mention convenience, but it does mean that when performed it looks a bit funny to the audience with an extra player standing around nearby playing along. The stars here, and the ones delivering the punchline, are the coro piccolo tenors, with a nicely pungent D around their primo passaggio, where they start to mix coming up from the chest register. This gives their line a certain earnest urgency, passing along the bad news that last year's lover has gotten the hell out of Dodge, perhaps getting a bit fed up with all the coddling he was expected to deliver to the poetess. Orff builds the humor into the emotion, emphasizing the first repeated word, hinc, and then repeating the entire phrase, hinc equitavit, he has ridden away, gradually diminishing, and then echoing the last 2 syllables a few more times as the messenger themselves fades into the distance. The second half of the page scales down the orchestration even further, to a simple sounding held D4 in first horn under a glockenspiel D 2 octaves above, between which the forlorn sopranos and altos ask who will love them now. The chorale sticks to simple root triads throughout, calling back very strongly some similar passages in Holst's Venus and Neptune. As with the Kullando section on the last screen, We see an arcing slur across the entire phrase, implying an ultra-smooth sense of connectivity, though of course the singers will be catching their breath after each shorter slur, and even throwing in a bit of a dramatic pause after the third and final "aya." Though there's definitely a sense of longing and disappointment, the element of truly sorrowful tragedy is absent. This all seems to be play acting at its heart. The next screen answers our lovelorn poetess, with a slightly softer replay of the galloping strings and timpani, but sans tenors, as one assumes they've all arrived at the next forest over by now, where no doubt they'll find other lovers, but probably no difference in the cloying, somewhat embarrassing baby talk and tiresome swooning. Meanwhile, back in this lovely burgeoning forest, the upper choir does their own swooning on a long, high G major 6/4 chord, a radiant harmony filled with nostalgia and a kind of pure, saintly yearning. The orchestration is custom-made to enhance the chord into glowing sonic ecstasy, making overtones do a lot of the work. First horn doubling the D of the altos an octave lower, and flutes doubling the sopranos, who are also supported by natural harmonics, indicated by the marking flageolet, in the second violins and violas. An octave higher, Orff doubles the same soprano pitches with divisi first violin harmonics. Their doubling by glockenspiel further enhances the glowing overtones, making this final chord one of the most sonically magical moments in the entire song cycle, when it's done right. After all that, you might want to go back to the beginning and hear everything in order along to the score. But there's no need in this case, as Orff has built a full identical repeat right into the song, using the second half of the lyrics as they translate the first half into Middle High German. I'll play that for you now, then get ready for next month's encounter with some very willful, flirtatious lyrics that aren't bothering to wait around for some old lover to come galloping back, especially not when they've got sleigh bells and muted trumpets to help them hunt down a man. See you then.